In this video we're going to see how to use Alpine JS to control whether or not a modal is shown on a page, and how to use HTMX to submit a complaint to our backend server and return a simple partial that indicates whether that was successful or not. All of these are styled with very simple Tailwind components, and we're going to see how we can build this modal system using Alpine. So let's get started and we'll dive into VS Code. So we have here a very simple Django project. It has a base.html file, and there are 3 scripts loading Tailwind, HTMX and Alpine JS into our project. And below that we also have within the body tag a content block, and then our index.html template extends that base, and this is where we're going to write code throughout this tutorial. Now to build a modal we need to grab some code, and what I'm going to do is get some code from this page here. This is 𝗵𝗽𝗽𝗀, which contains some pre-built Tailwind components. Now the aim in this tutorial is to submit a form to the backend, use HTMX to submit that form, and then return a response, and we're going to do that within a modal. So to do that I'm going to use this section here, the form element. So if you click that, and this link will be in the description as well, what we're going to do is just grab this code here, we're going to copy it to our index.html template, and then we'll modify that to our purposes. And remember, what we're submitting is a complaint form with some very basic fields. So you can copy this code here, and we're going to paste that into our index.html file as so. So what I'm going to do now is start the Django server, and we're going to see how this looks by default. So with the server running, you can go to the front end and you see just this button here that says toggle modal. The idea is when we click this button, we want to show the form within the modal. The problem at the moment is that this doesn't work because we don't have the 𝗵𝗽𝗽𝗀 library, which contains the JavaScript to write this code. So we're going to do that using Alpine. Now, before we go on changing the form, we need to create the model to capture the complaints, and we're also going to create a form class. So let's go to modals.py, and we're going to create a class here for complaints. So we will create a Django model that will inherit from the modals.model class, and we're going to have 3 fields in that class. Firstly, the text, the content of the complaint. We're also going to have an email field so that the imaginary company that receives the complaint can email back the customer, and we're also going to have a simple created field that captures when the complaint was submitted. So that's a date time field. So that's a very simple model. Let's stop the server and we're going to run Python's migrations command. Now the first command is make migrations, which will generate a migrations file. And once we've done that, we can then run migrate to actually create the database tables. So we should now have a complaint table in our database with 3 columns for each of these fields. What we're now going to do is create a Django form. Now I'm going to go to the forms.py file. This only contains 1 import at the moment. If you don't have that, create a forms.py file, import Django's forms, and what we're also going to do is from core.modals, we will import that complaint model that we just created. So what we're going to do now is create a class, and it's going to be called complaint form. This is our Django form class, and it's going to inherit from forms.model form. And a model form gives you an easy way to bind a form to the fields in a particular model. So we create a meta class here, and then we can specify the model, and the model is going to be the complaint model that we have just created. Now another argument we need here in the meta class is the fields that we want to actually render in the form. Firstly, we're going to render the text field that allows users to submit the complaint, and the second field is of course the email address. We want users to be able to specify an email address so that we can email back and say sorry for whatever it was you are not happy about. And one other field I'm going to create here is called labels. I'm going to map the text field to a label of complaint, and that's because we want to actually show complaint on the label in the form. We don't want to just say text, which doesn't give much information. So now that we've created the model and the form, we're going to go to views.py, and we have a very simple index view here. We're going to extend that and use the form so that it's actually displayed on the page. Now firstly I need to import the model and the form from the respective modules, and then we're going to show that within the view. So what we need to do is when a user sends a request to this view, we're going to instantiate the complaint form, and then we're going to add that to our context with a key name of form and just place that in there. So this form is now available within our template, the index.html template. And later on we're going to reference these fields in this particular template. For now we're just sticking with the code we got from 𝗵𝗽𝗽𝗀. So let's start by wrapping all of this code we got from 𝗵𝗽𝗽𝗀 within a div. So right down to the bottom we'll close that off, and we can tab all of this content here over to make that look a bit cleaner. And the main reason for doing this, we're going to create an Alpine component on this div, this root div, which will determine whether or not the modal is shown at a given time. And we're also going to give this a class to give some margin to it, and we're going to reference a Tailwind class of margin 8 here. And I'm also going to put a header on this page, simple p tag with some Tailwind classes. Text 3XL will make the text quite large, and that's going to say complaints page. And finally, I'm just going to quickly render out the form so that you can see that on the page. So when we save this template, we can run the Django server again, and we should be able to see that form on the page along with this new header. So let's refresh, and you can see we get the complaints page as well as this horrific looking form. We need to style that up a little bit better. Now what I'm going to do for now is remove this form element from the page, and I'm also going to remove a hidden class here, as you can see from the actual modal content. This hidden class is there by default from the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 component. If we remove that, we should be able to actually see the form that we got from the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 site. So let's go back to the page, and if we refresh this page, that's the form we get. And we're going to clean this up a little bit later and use the form class that we created. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to conditionally display this form using Alpine JS. So to do that, we need to create an Alpine component. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do that in the root div tag here. So what I'm going to do is add an xData directive. And to that, we're going to set a field called 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀. And by default, that's going to be false in our application. So at the beginning, when this loads, 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 will be false, and when we click this button here, we want to set it to true. Now that's very easy to do with Alpine. We simply attach a click event to this button, and then we can reference what we have in the state. So we're going to set 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 equal to true here when we click that button. And we can then add an xShow directive to the modal, the root of the modal, which is this div here. So what I'm going to do is add that now. The directive is xShow, and we're going to set that equal to 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀. Now, if we save this and go back to the page here, if I refresh, you can see that by default that modal is not shown. But when we click the button, we see that it is shown. So the state management is working, but unfortunately our modal is displayed over the button, so it's hidden the content beneath the modal. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is we're going to center this component using Flexbox. And Tailwind has some handy Flexbox styles built in. And we're going to add these to this modal div that wraps all of the content within the modal. So what we're going to do is scroll over to the classes here, and we'll add a flex class, and we'll also add justify center, which will center it on the main axis. If we save that and go back to the page and refresh, when we toggle the modal, we now see it appears in the center of the page. It doesn't overwrite this content here. Now there are certain things we want to do with this modal. When we click the cross, we want to close it off. So we want to update this state here, 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀, and set that back to false. Now it's this HTML here, this button that contains an SVG element, that's what actually shows the cross. So to the button we can add a click event, and on the click event we can set the 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 element to false. So we attach a click event to that button and we say 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 equals false when that cross is clicked. So if we save that and go back to the page and refresh, you should now be able to toggle whether that's shown. When you click toggle modal here, it will show it, and when you click the cross, it disappears because it's updating that state that is actually shown here with the xShow attribute. Now another thing we want to do is when we click away from the modal when it's open, for example clicking here, we want to actually close it. We don't want to show the modal when we click away. We want to go back to the main page. So we're going to use some Alpine modifiers to do this on a click event. If we go to the documentation, there's a section here on modifiers, and these allow you to customize the behavior of your event listeners, such as the click event. Now the one we're interested in is this one here, the outside modifier. So this is a convenience helper. It listens for a click outside of the element that it's attached to. So the event will only fire if the click occurs outside of the element that this is attached to. So we're going to attach a click event to the page, and more specifically to this modal. Anytime that we click outside of the modal, we want to update the state. So let's add this modifier, and we're going to do this on the child div of the parent one here. So what we're going to do is we'll add a click event as normal, and this time instead of just click, we're going to say click.outside, and that uses the outside modifier that we just discussed. And when that happens, we're going to set 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 equal to false again. So let's save that, and we'll go back to the page and refresh. When we toggle the modal and then click outside of the modal's content, it disappears as we expect. When we click inside the modal, nothing happens. So it's only when we click away from the modal. And that's the desired behavior usually for a modal. So I think that's enough setup of the modal. What we're going to do now is stop the Django server and we're going to install a library called Django widget tweaks, which is going to help us render our form class. Remember that we created a form class here in forms.py. We're now going to use those fields in the form that we show on this page instead of the fields we got by default from 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝘀. So once you have installed Django widget tweaks with pip, you can then use that in your application. To do that, we need to go to our settings.py file. So we'll go there, and to installed apps, as you can see here, you can add at the bottom widget tweaks. And make sure we put a comma there between the core app. And once you've done that, you can go to index.html, and at the top, underneath the extend statement, we can load widget tweaks, and that will allow us to use the features of that package in this template. So what we need to do now is we need to clean up this form. We don't need all of this. We only need two fields, one for the email address and one for the text that comprises the complaint. So we're going to change a few things about this form here, and all the form is within the modal, so we're going to be changing all of this code here. Now this H3 element is the header for our modal. It says at the moment sign into our platform. We're going to get rid of that and we're going to replace that with submit complaint. And we're also going to change the content of the submit button, which you can see here at the bottom. So at the moment this submit button says, if we scroll over there, log into your account, we're just going to say submit instead of that. And we can get rid of this not registered div, we don't need that. And if we go to the page at the moment, we can see what this looks like. It's got a couple of extra fields, remember me and lost password. We're going to get rid of those too. So back to the template, and these are actually contained down here and at the bottom here. So we can remove that entire div. And then if we go back to our form, it looks a little bit cleaner. We've got two fields and a submit button. Now instead of email and password, we're going to render the text and the email from the Django form class. You can see the form here, it's got two of the fields from the model, and these are the text and the email fields. And what we're going to do in our template is we're going to replace these two default fields here, these divs that contain the default fields from 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝘀, we're going to replace them with what we have in our form. Now to be quick about this, I'm just going to delete this and paste in these divs here. And we use the render field template tag from Django widget tweaks. We render the form.text label and indeed the form.text field itself, and we're attaching those same Tailwind classes that we had before. And we also do this with the email field. So if we save this and go back to the page, refresh, when we toggle this modal, we now see the two fields that we actually created in the Django form. And you can customize these styles if you want. Tailwind has loads of classes that you can use. We'll just go with this for now. And the next step in this video, we're going to actually submit this form using HTMX. So remember, we have HTMX, it's loaded up here in the base template from this script tag here. If you don't have that, make sure it's added to the base.html template. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to our template here and the form tag here. Now this HTML element, we're going to add some HTMX attributes. So firstly, we're going to add an HX post attribute, and we're going to send that to the index URL that we have already created in this application. So if we go to urls.py, we have one path here. It's the path with the name of index, which maps to the index view that we're already working with. So when we submit this form, it's going to go to the same view that we've already used here. When we submit, it will send an HTTP post request. Otherwise, it's going to be a GET request. So we can differentiate between when we've got a form that's submitted and when we're dealing just with a GET request. Now we're also going to add to the form element an HX trigger of submit. So when the form is submitted, that is what's actually going to trigger this particular event, this post request. I think that's actually the default for form elements, but we'll add that explicitly anyway. And the final thing I want to add is an HX target. So what I'm going to do is add an HX target attribute here. And what we're going to do is we're going to return an HTML response from the server that just contains a message saying whether or not the form submission has been successful. Now we'll create this in a second, but I'm going to reference an HTML element with an ID of information. And this is just going to be what returns the information about whether or not the submission was successful. And what we're going to do is below this button here that submits the form, I'm going to add that div here with the ID of information and a few Tailwind classes. So what that means is when we submit the form, the returned HTML from the server is going to be placed within this div here. So now we need to write the code in the view that will process a post request. So what we're going to say is if the request.method is equal to post, in that case what we're going to do is instantiate the form. It's going to be the complaint form, but instead of an empty instantiation, we're going to pass the data we got from the post request, which we can access through the request.post attribute. Let me fix the spelling here, that should be complaint form. Once we've instantiated the form with the data that's been sent to the server, we can then check whether or not the form is valid using the form.isValid method. All forms in Django have this method to perform validation of the data. If it's valid, we can then call the form.save method. This is a function that exists on Django modal forms. Now remember, we created a modal form here. When you create a modal form, it contains a save method that allows you to directly save that particular data to the database. This doesn't exist in normal forms, only on modal forms, because those are actually mapped to Django models. So keep that in mind when you're calling form.save. And after we've saved, we can then return a partial to the front end, and HTMX will swap that into that information div that we created. So in the event that we've successfully submitted a form and saved it, we will return a partial with success.html, which we'll create in just a second. And we're also going to return a partial if the form is not valid, and that will happen outside of this if statement, so we will return that here. So if the form is valid, we return the success partial, otherwise we're going to return the failure partial. And if we're not dealing with a post request, we skip down to these lines here and just render the form and attach it to the context. So what we now need to do as we come to the end of this video, we need to create these two partials here. So I'm going to create these within the templates folder. We're going to create a new folder, partials. And first of all, let's create the success.html partial, and we're going to paste a little bit of code in there. And it's just going to be a simple div, and it's going to have a background color of green and a border color of green as well. And it's going to say complaint submitted successfully. So that's all that's in the success partial. The failure.html partial is going to be very similar, and we'll paste this in here. We'll give it a color of red to indicate that something's gone wrong with the text. Something not ideal might be happening. A suitably vague message when you're submitting a complaint. So once we've done that, we can actually go back to the page and we're going to test out this form. So if we refresh, toggle the modal, we now see the modal. We can submit a complaint, something very simple that didn't work. We'll give an email address that's not real, and then we can submit that here, and what's going to happen is nothing. And that's because I've missed a key element of the form. So if we go back to the index.html, this contains our form tag here. Now what we need to do is, for security reasons, we attach the CSRF token. I've forgotten to do that, but you should do that when you're submitting a post request. So if we save that and go back to our page, we can toggle the modal, submit a complaint here like this, and basically now we have this very horrific looking message displayed below the form. It says complaint submitted successfully, but I think we're going to need to fix the styles here. And I think the problem here is that I've added this information div to the wrong place. Let's cut that out of the modal. It shouldn't belong in the modal. I actually want to put this underneath this button here that actually toggles the modal. So on the main part of the page, not in the modal. So we'll paste that in there, and the HTMX response should still be placed in this information div. If we go back to the page and refresh, I'm going to submit another complaint here, and when we hit submit now, we have this complaint submitted successfully. This little alert on the side that lets us know that that worked. Now let's quickly add a validation method to our Django form. We're going to validate the email field, and you can add that with a function called clean and then an underscore with the name of the field, in this case clean email. And what we can do here is we can get the email address that was submitted with the self.cleanedData attribute on the class, and we reference the email field here. That will give us what has been submitted. Now let's create a condition here where if the email starts with B, it's going to raise a form validation error. We're not allowed to submit complaints if our email address begins with B. Otherwise, we can simply return the email. There's been no problem with the function, and we resume as normal. Now let's test this out. If we go back to the page and refresh, we can then submit another complaint, and we can put an email address that begins with B in here. If we now submit this email address, you see that something not ideal might be happening. That's actually rendering the response is red because we're dealing with an issue here. And so depending on whether or not our form was saved successfully, we'll get a green success message or a red failure message. Now what we want to do now is very quickly prove that these are actually being saved to the database. And we're going to use Django's admin to do this. So I'm going to add a bit of code here into the admin.py file. We import the complaint model and we register it with the admin. And then what we can do is stop the server and we can run python manage.py, and the command is create super user. The username we're going to create is called admin, and we'll give it a password of test. And we can then run the server again and navigate to the Django admin here, and it's just going to be /admin, and we can log in with our admin user, and then we should be able to see the complaints here on the left. And as you can see, we have 2 complaint objects in the database, and these are both complaints that have been submitted from our form in the Modal and submitted by HTMX. So to prove that this is working, let's submit a new form here. We'll go back to the page, we'll submit a complaint saying this company is terrible, and we'll attach an email address to that. If we submit that, we get the green message saying that that has been successful. We can go back now to the admin interface, go to complaints, and we see that we have received that. That exists in our database, and that's all working fine. Now there's one final step I'd like to perform. This is the last thing in the tutorial, but basically one thing we've got here is that when we submit a form, Modal is not cleared from the page. It stays in the middle of the page. We want to maybe shut that down, so what we're going to do is use Alpine to do that. So when we submit this form here, I want to attach another click event, which will then close down the modal. So let's go back to the index.html template, and the button that we want to click is this one here at the bottom. This is the submit button, and I'm going to add a click event to this now. So on the click, and we're also going to add a debounce, which will add a short delay before actually performing the action, and we're going to debounce by 100 milliseconds. And what happens then is we're going to say show modal equals false. So we're going to hide the modal by setting this state to false, and we're going to debounce, which means we're going to wait. So let's see that in action now. Save the file, and we'll go back to the page and refresh. If we submit a complaint, this time when we hit the submit button, we expect to see the modal disappear because it's changing the Alpine state that controls whether this was shown. So let's hit submit, and you see that that disappears. Now there was a syntax error in that statement. If we go back to this here, it should be a dot instead of a colon. So when you use debounce, make sure there's a dot when you specify the time period after that. So let's try that again. We toggle the modal and we submit a complaint, and you see that there was a very slight delay there. Let's increase that delay to 2000 milliseconds so we can see that in action. If we save that and return to the page, we should now see that this waits 2 seconds before submitting a complaint. So if we hit submit, the modal stays around for 2 seconds and then disappears. So you can use debounce to perform these types of actions where you use a slight delay after an event. And debounce is one of many Alpine modifiers that we have, and you can find a list of them here on this page, which I'll link in the description. Debounce and throttle are very similar if you want to delay an action until something has occurred, and these are very useful to know about. So that's all for this video. This particular interface is quite rough. You'd obviously want to improve that, but this shows how to use Alpine to control when a modal is shown on a page, and how to use HTMX to submit a form that exists within that modal. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next one.